Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. If you watched only MSNBC or CNN or Fox on Tuesday night, if this was your only source of news for the day, you truly would not know that the UK, a country with whom the US has a so-called special relationship, has a new prime minister. And just maybe, as Americans are still litigating and arguing about an election 2 years ago, the elegant and smooth transfer of power in the UK is both a sight to behold and a reminder that in a democracy, the peaceful transfer of power is still one of the most important single parts in making that democracy work. And if that isn't enough, there is the broader question of what a new UK government means to the US, to Europe, to the world, and most of all, to the people of the United Kingdom. Newly minted Prime Minister Liz Truss has emerged as the leader of her Conservative Party and become the nation's new Prime Minister. She's Britain's third woman Prime Minister, and she has assembled a cabinet that is based both on meritocracy and one that would make any diversity, equity, and inclusion executive blush with envy. But this is not just about global perception. Prime Minister Truss has inherited a nation mired in inflation, struggling with both the accessibility and cost of energy, still navigating a post-Brexit landscape, struggling with both employment and the burgeoning cost of the nation's National Health Service, as well as high taxes and a war raging on the European continent. To try and walk us through all of this, I'm joined by British Conservative Member of Parliament, Jesse Norman. Jesse Norman is widely regarded as one of the rising stars of the British House of Commons and was just this week appointed Minister of State at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the Truss government. He holds a PhD in philosophy from University College London and is the author of brilliant biographies of both Edmund Burke and Adam Smith. He served as Financial Secretary to the Treasury from 2019 to 2021 and has served as a Member of Parliament since 2010. It is my pleasure to welcome the Right Honorable Jesse Norman here to the Who, What, Why podcast. Jesse, thanks so much for joining us.
Jeff, it's an absolute pleasure. Very lovely to talk to you again and to be able to analyze these fascinating developments we've had in Britain.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. You were one of the earlier folks to come out for the resignation of Boris Johnson. You had been a supporter of his for a long time. Talk about that first, why you felt it was time for him to move on.
Well, it was a very difficult decision for me because I've known Boris for more than 40 years, and we've always been friends, and our families have been friends. We've been on holiday together, so I know him very well. And so one never gets to the point of writing a letter of no confidence on that kind of basis without a lot of prior reflection and soul searching. But by the time I wrote, which was actually some way before the eventual moment of his departure from office, 4 or 5 weeks before, when it was by no means obvious that it was going to happen, and many of my colleagues were deeply concerned but were holding their fire. The reason that I wrote was because there had been a series of events that had crystallized in my mind, and I thought very obviously in a way that could not be easily controverted. And so I thought it was important to put those down on paper and explain publicly why Boris should not continue. And if I may, Jeff, I'll just touch on what those were. So the first had to do with a specific scandal in Britain over the last year or so, which has been called Partygate, which is the revelation that at a time when Number 10 and the Prime Minister were sending very, very strict messages to the general public to stay at home, not to go out, not to see their loved ones, not to engage in all the normal aspects of social life and social interaction, family life. At that time, there was in fact a whole series of social gatherings and parties in Number 10 Downing Street itself, and that Boris had himself been present at several of these. And that caused a feeling of great revulsion amongst the general public. And of course, it was weaponized by different parts of the political spectrum. people on the left, but also many people of what you might call the quiet, silent majority, small c conservative disposition were very concerned about that. And they were undoubtedly mobilized in a way that did not do the Prime Minister any favors. So I thought it was really important to put that on the record, but also to go beyond that and to say that there had been some investigations, and to say that it wasn't just about that, it was also about substantive policies that were not succeeding and were almost certainly impractical, and really about punching a certain kind of culture war bruise. And then finally, and this will have a particular resonance, I think, in America, about the emergence of a kind of presidential culture in Britain. And the Brits are completely allergic to this idea because, of course, we have a parliamentary democracy. The Prime Minister has no national mandate. He or she has a mandate only from his or her electors in their district, in their constituency, and then as member of Parliament, and then as Prime Minister from their fellow MPs. And so the idea that Boris was kind of promulgating, and the people around him were promulgating, which was that on the basis of the 2019 election, he was like a president, had a national mandate, could not be removed from office without a general election. These things are completely foreign to our constitutional tradition. I thought it was very important to nail down what had gone wrong. And all of that, to me, added up to a very clear verdict, which was that both in terms of the way he behaved on Partygate, as it was called, and in terms of current policy and the inability to achieve certain things that Conservatives needed to do, and in terms of this creeping constitutional presidentialism, I was very sorry to say he had to go. And that letter I put online. I normally get about 3 likes and 5 retweets on Twitter. And by the time I got to 15,000 retweets and 35,000 likes, I was beginning to realize that actually I'd struck a bit of a chord. And I think it did become the document that people used when they were reflecting in a kind of independent centrist way, not partisan, but a centrist way about the Prime Minister's position. And then, of course, about 5 weeks later, he did something which completely confirmed all the worst fears people had had about his kind of blustering and, I'm afraid, somewhat disingenuous fibbing style, and that, I'm afraid, was when the roof fell.
What were your concerns about a leadership battle within the Conservative Party? These things, while it seemed to go smoothly, these things, when they start, one never knows what twists and turns they'll take and what impact it might have on the ongoing policy of the Conservative Party.
Yes, that's true. When we have leadership contests in Britain, they very rarely happen while the individual is Prime Minister. As it were, when the party is in government, and therefore it's the departure of an existing party. We happen to have had 2 in the last 5 years, but that's a great rarity in general. And this was one which was a fully contested leadership election, and both both individuals remained in the race to the very end, which hadn't happened previous time round. And as a result, the previous one had been artificially shorter. So this was really about 6 or 7 weeks of discussion, debate, internal voting to choose 2 candidates within the Conservative Party, parliamentary party. That took about a week, a little bit longer. And then in accordance with the constitution of the Conservative Party, it was then put to the membership, which 180-odd thousand people. And there was a series of hustings and debates so that they could become fully informed about the nature of the 2 candidates, and the 2 candidates could be put on the spot and held to account. And that was a very interesting process. It went on, I think, longer than anyone would have wanted. But at the same time, these were national debates. They were being analysed and reviewed and discussed by people way outside the Conservative Party. And they achieved a certain degree of national cut-through. And so people now, I think, even if you're not a member of the Conservative Party, do feel they have a much better understanding of the 2 candidates. And out of those 2, actually the front runner amongst the MPs did not prove to be the one who the party members had chosen. And that is an important fact in its own right. And Liz Truss, who was selected, has now in fact overtaken her rival in the number of MPs. But, she literally started yesterday. We had her in parliamentary questions, Prime Minister's questions today. And it was fascinating because I think the Labour Party had been thinking, well, this is someone whom we can very easily attack, and we can use some of the disagreements that aired during the campaign process in order to attack her. And actually, she proved to be extremely effective and more than capable of repelling the attack made on her by the Labour Party. And very interestingly, she brought a freshness and a directness and a lack of prevarication and a lack of bluster that I think many people will have found enormously refreshing.
The New York Times had a profile of her yesterday, and one of the key takeaways from that was really as somebody who often went against the mainstream, who was always looking for different or disruptive ways to approach problems. Talk about that.
I mean, you probably know, Jeff, that the New York Times is in a very strange place in its reporting
Indeed.
on Britain at the moment. It's amazing. It seems to have been, I've got nothing but respect. I lived in the States for 6 years. I know the New York Times well. I've read it for years. And it's just, it's going through a process of kind of, I don't know whether it's Brit hating or just Brit conservative hating, but it's a very strange thing. But yes, so Liz Truss is someone who has argued and articulated positions that are of a distinctly and genuinely libertarian view throughout her political career. And even, when she was a student politician, which she was and growing up, she was a member of another political party, the Liberal Democrats in Britain. But what is interesting is that even in that move from them to the Conservative Party, she has not lost a conception she has of personal, individual freedom, both in one's own life and also politically and economically. And I think that is enormously attractive to a lot of people. And, she isn't in any kind of straightforward way someone you can put into a kind of box. She grew up in Scotland and Leeds, and she went to a comprehensive school, but she also went to Oxford. And she's got quite a strong northern accent. So, she doesn't fit into these kind of standard cookie cutter conceptions of what a conservative is supposed to sound like. But what is interesting is that intellectually, ideologically, if you like, this strong commitment to freedom has always distinguished her. And one of the really interesting things about politics now is going to be how that sense of freedom manifests itself. And it's very recognizable to an American because there's a strand of libertarian thinking in America, which I think she would find enormously congenial. And of course, that doesn't mean that she doesn't support and doesn't respect many British institutions such as the NHS, but it does mean that she brings a kind of astringency to wanting to put things to a market test, to open them up, to make them more transparent, to make them, if possible, more competitive. And I think many people will find that, and I personally, in many ways, find that highly attractive.
And you touched on that a little bit, or at least got kind of to the heart of it, the core of it, in an op-ed that you wrote recently, saying that there really needed to be more focus on consumers over producers. What did you mean by that, and how does that fit into this framework that you're talking about?
Well, it's such an interesting question. My point was that in Britain at the moment, there's a tremendous preoccupation for perfectly understandable political reasons with what you might call the big fiscal judgments. How much protection should be offered to the least well-off, to community organizations, to small businesses, if at all, whose energy prices may be going up by 5 or 6 times. And we have a significant section of the population that is simply not going to be able to afford. The rise in energy prices vastly exceeds their disposable income. So something is going to have to be done to respect and support those people. if we're going to get through this. And in its own way, it's as testing as the pandemic was. And, you had your payroll protection scheme or paycheck protection scheme. And we had a thing called the furlough scheme, which I ran myself out of the Treasury, and turned out to be enormously successful, I'm pleased to say. But people are expecting that scale of government response when you get this scale of tremendous health or economic shock. So that's the context. But I was saying that there's an awful lot of things you can do. And I think it's very consistent with the Liz Truss view of the world that her government could do that does not involve spending an enormous amount of money. It just involves making public services, both provided by the state and provided by the privatized industries and provided by regular companies that act as almost as utilities, to improve the user experience and customer service. And actually sitting behind that is a bigger focus, which says, look, we're not going to focus as much on as it were, the producer interest. We are going to focus on the individual end user. And I'll give you examples. So in Britain, we've had a problem. People wanted to get a passport recently from the government, or wanting to get their driving license renewed. But we've also had tremendous problems with people trying to avoid exigent mortgage or financial charges, or just trying to change travel tickets on apps and websites, and an enormous array of different things. And of course, these hit the least well off the worst, because very often they don't have, they can't afford to have people, they can't buy the executive service, they can't buy the what you might call the person to stand in line for them. They have to deal with the cost. And it's really important that a Conservative government puts itself in the position of those ordinary working men and women, many of them in my constituency, and just ask the question, how can we support those people? How can we make the system work better for them? And then behind that, how can we make our markets more competitive? And how can we redress the balance between often a highly technologically enabled central company and a very widely dispersed group of purchasers or clients? And I think there's a much bigger competition and markets agenda there over the next few years.
How does that fit in the hierarchy of things that need to be addressed, given the problems that the new government and the country is facing today, particularly the twin problems of inflation, which has gone out of hand in many respects, and also of high taxes?
Yes. The effect of the war and the constraints on supply imposed by the recovery from COVID have meant that inflation, wage inflation, but also raw materials inflation, energy prices, has spiked to levels that we have not seen since the 1980s in this country. We're talking of 10, 11%. People are talking much higher than that even in Britain. So there's a serious issue of inflation. And that goes alongside the specific problem about how people are going to afford energy costs over the next 12 months through the winter and the rest of it. So those are going to be front and center of the government's kind of emergency response. But then there's also a big issue about how you lift national productivity. There's a big issue about housing, how you get a more functional housing market and more housing to people who are in need of it, who are, maybe buying for the first time, or looking to trade, or looking to realize some value, and a housing market that's quite over demanded and undersupplied and quite congested. And then the other problem, of course, has to do with family formation, loneliness, early years education. So I'd say those are four of the big problems that the government's going to be faced in with a couple of years still to run, 2.5 years or so, 2.25 years in this parliament. I think there's only going to be time and attention to really to deal with 3 or 4 big issues. But I do think that sitting behind them needs to be this question about orientation towards consumers and market functioning. And of course, one of the reasons why energy costs are so high is because of various attempts have been made to manipulate energy retail markets, and they've had some fairly catastrophic results. And so in a way, it's natural to start thinking about how we can get a better deal for consumers by also looking at the deeper way in which markets have not functioned very well. And if you'll excuse me, Jeff, a bit of a plug, if anyone's interested in the kind of a kind of take on how markets function now and some of these concerns about rent extraction and unfairness, asymmetries of information and power. I talk about this in my book on Adam Smith. And one of the things that comes out of a Smithian view of this, and that I think many Americans will understand, that the genius of Adam Smith is that it does cover many of these things, is that markets are all different from each other. The energy market is different from the financial markets, and financial markets are different from each other, and they're different from consumer goods and white goods and the rest. And so it really does demand quite a sophisticated policy-making agenda from government in order to address these problems in a really integrated and collective way.
And to what extent does the manipulation of energy prices as a result of the war in Ukraine have an impact on all of this? And does it make it more difficult to solve these problems in these kind of market-driven ways?
Yes, it undoubtedly does. And of course, when one's thinking in traditional terms, one tends to think of war, right, actual conflict between nations. That would, and then one thinks of trade wars. That is to say, you put tariffs on steel, and I'll put them on, food and drink, whatever it might be. But this is a different thing. This is the carrying on of war through trade, war itself through trade. That's what Mr. Putin is doing. He is trying to use oil and gas as a weapon to divide and impoverish his enemies. And of course, it's really important that the US and the UK stick together, and the UK, as longtime ally and friend of the United States, is able then to act with its European partners. And an awful lot can be overdone in thinking about the EU. I mean, we still work incredibly closely with the French, the Germans, the Spanish, Italians, the Dutch, major European states, in fact, all European states. So we really do need a kind of integrated approach in dealing towards Russia in a joined up way. And that's going to involve a recognition that, different states are going to have different concerns and different impacts, and they've got to be managed in a way that presents a united front, because if we get divided by President Putin, that would be catastrophic for everyone. And of course, you then get into a situation in which some people can get played off against each other, and you've started to get a lack of a unified front, and then at some point, potentially the collapse of a political will. And I think if there's anything we need now, and anything we need to do to support Ukraine in its valiant struggle against this completely unprovoked Russian aggression, it is to stand tall and stand together, both on the issue of oil and gas, but also on the issue of supplying the Ukrainians with the weapons and the other things that they need to be effective.
And to what extent does the hangover from Brexit still play a role in the politics and policy in the UK right now?
I think it's very easy to overstate the problem because yes, we have come out of the EU. Yes, there are some important continuing issues we have to manage, of trade and of the relationship with Northern Ireland and Ireland. But actually, the security and defense side has never been part of this concern. And even throughout the Brexit process, it was recognized on all sides that security, defense, intelligence sharing, coordination should be kept separate from that. And that remains extremely strong across the UK and Europe. And of course, the Five Eyes system of intelligence gathering that we have developed with others around the world remains intact as well, and is something on which all parties rely. So there is a kind of structure there that is thoroughly resilient, thoroughly effective, and very badly needed now.
Member of Parliament Jesse Norman, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast, and for giving us these insights into what's happening in your country and your government.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Jeff.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the Who, What, Why podcast. I hope you join us next week for another radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.